For those of you who registered for this webinar didn't have a chance to go through the diagnostic, we have a CR diagnostic. You can click on this, or you can come back to this room and click on the diagnostic. And then for those of you who want to know a bit more about our scholar name offerings, you can really click on scholar name for data insights. With that, we also have some upcoming free webinars. Let me hide all of this. We have a free webinar on arithmetic. That's arithmetic for the current GMAT and for the Focus Edition, and so that's tomorrow, exactly a day from now. Pyle would be hosting that webinar. If you need help in number properties, word problems, and advanced topics, this is the webinar for you. Then next week we have a study plan webinar. And this is much more specific to the Focus Edition. So if you need help with building a study plan to get to a certain Focus Edition score, want to understand the fundamentals of Focus Edition and so on and so forth, then this is the webinar for you over here. So you can click on register now and get to this webinar. With that, let's go right into the webinar pane. The screen will have changed for you at this point. You should be seeing pre-thinking for assumptions. I'm going to put in a yes/no poll question to make sure that we get input from you to see whether you can see the screen pre-thinking for assumption. Select yes if you can see the black slide which says pre-thinking for assumption. Otherwise, select no. All right, pretty much everyone can see that. That's wonderful. So just some logistics here. What you see over here is a presentation pane. This is where a lot of my content would be shown, and then from this is where I'd be talking, showing all the questions, the solutions. We'll be talking to it. Below the presentation pane is a Q&A pod. So here I moved the Q&A pod a bit to the right hand side. So this is where you can post your questions, and when you post your questions, they go in a queue, and that allows me to answer them in sequence or at appropriate time. On the right hand side is a place for my questions and your answers. So I'll have short answer polls here. I'll have open-ended questions here, which is where I have a generic short answer pod for. So this is where you can free flow type your text. And then from time to time also, I'll also have questions which are multiple response and so on and so forth. So just if you have questions below the presentation, if I have questions, they'll be on the right hand side. Okay, this webinar is going to last about 2 hours. And yes, good thing to test. You must be an engineer. It's going to last for a couple of hours from this point on, and then after that, if you still have questions, post those. I'd be happy to stay back. I'd be happy to address any question that you have about your GMAT, about your study plan, about any aspect of your preparation, or in fact even your MBA. Okay. So with that, let's just get started with the webinar. So we have essentially 3 parts of this webinar. In the first part, we're going to talk about this. Let me get my annotation here. I'm going to talk about your study plan. This is something that I want to make sure that we do, because a lot of you don't build your study plan. A lot of you who are e-GMATers actually don't, do a good job of building that study plan. So I want to make sure each one of you does that. How many of your e-GMAT are paid students here, just as a poll, just to understand the makeup of this group? If you're a paid student, select yes. If you're someone who's exploring the free trial, then select no. Okay, let's get a few more responses. I have about 74 students here in the webinar. It's about 50-50 is what I'm seeing. Can I get about 50 responses here? That'd be great. I have about 45. Let's get 5 more responses. The question is, are you a paid student? If you are, then select yes. If you are someone who's exploring the free trial, select no. Okay, but half and half. All right. So the first part's going to be about your study plan. Then we're going to go into the core of this webinar, and then, as I said, towards the end, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to stay back and address those questions. Okay. So with that, let's kind of start with building your personalized study plan. I'm going to add a new share pod here. So, and I'm going to make it a bit more specific for the focus edition, uh, 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 but essentially, if you have if you need a study plan for the current edition, it would work just the same way. Okay. So with that, let's talk about your study plan over here. So when you log into your e-GMAT account, this is a screen that you see, and you go to your plan. You can go to your personalized study planner, and let's kind of start over here. We're going to build that personalized study plan. You go to the screen. If you're an e-GMATer, you have access to this. If you're not an e-GMATer, you can request one. Let's create your study plan. First, set your target score. Let's set it to 685 here, um, and set it as target. Then let's get your current score. Let's do a 475. Let's say you got it from an MBA.com test. By the way, we also have a Sigma X mock that does give you your really good estimate of your current score, as well as it gives you your starting abilities as well. So then let's get your starting score. So it says current sectional scores over here. Let's say this person has an 18 verbal, a 75 in quant, and then based on that, it tells you that you should have a score between 64 to 68 because you have a 475. Let's say 66 over here. Then let's get your target sectional score. So what it does is it looks at your current abilities, and then it looks at what you need to get to your target score, which is 685, which is 97 percentile. You can really see that here. And then it gives you a recommendation on verbal, quant, and DI. And this is a fair recommendation. I like this, but I don't like that 100 percentile in verbal. So what I would rather do is I would aim for an 88 in verbal, and correspondingly, I have to get a higher score in quant and a higher score in DI. If you want to put a different recommendation, you can do that as well. I'm going to put an 86 in verbal, an 85 in quant, and then an 81 in DI, and it will tell you how much more challenging it is. But let's kind of go with this. 23% is not a whole lot more. Then at this point in time, what I'm going to do is uh, I will look at this, and it'll give me estimates of how long will it take for me to get there. I can see the number of hours that I need to put in to get to this score, and where would those hours go. So in verbal, where would I'd need about 77 hours to go from a 60th percentile. Let's just zoom this in over here so you guys can see this, to essentially a 98th percentile. In quant, I'd need uh, uh, essentially about 159 hours to go to improve from a 35th to an 89th percentile. And again, remember, quant and verbal skills help you in data insights as well, which is why you need just about 96 hours to get to a 90th percentile in quant. So a lot of the effort that you in DI, sorry, a lot of the effort that you're doing in quant and verbal, that helps you in DI as well. So it helps in DI, that ensures that you don't have to put as many hours over there. Then it actually gives you your subsectional study plans as well. Subsection means within verbal you're looking at CR and RC. Within quant you're looking at arithmetic and algebra, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to put in my CR percentile. I'm going to put in my RC percentile here. And this is all of this data is when you take a diagnostic test, either on e-GMAT.com or MBA.com, you get this data here. So it takes that input, it now looks at what your target score is, and then it tells you how long would you need in CR and how long would you need in RC. You accept that, then it does the same thing with quant. Again, really say 40th percentile here and 25th percentile here, takes this into account, and again, then based on the data from upwards of 10,000 students, it tells you how long would you need in arithmetic and how long in algebra, and it assumes that you're going to spend about 20 hours a week. If you spend longer, you get done sooner. Let's do the same thing with DI here. So I'm going to put this here. Look at DI milestones. Very similar stuff. You can see the amount of time needed. I'm going to accept that. You now have your quant, verbal, and DI milestones. You can expand this, figure out, when do you start your quant, when do you start your verbal, how long do you need for each of these areas. Now you can really put in your time commitments here. You can also sequence your study. It says start with verbal, then go to quant, then do DI. Again, you do DI always towards the end. Okay. So let's say you're someone who who can put in about 5 hours per day during weekdays, and 2 hours per day during weekdays and 5 hours per day during the weekend. That's that gets you to 20 hours. But let's say these things are slightly different. A lot of people have more work on Mondays and Tuesdays, so they can, I'm going to put 1 hour each on Monday and Tuesday. Or let's just say one. Then Wednesday, Thursday, say I'm going to be able to do three, three, and three. That gives you 21 hours. Again, you can customize the same thing on the weekend as well. You can pick your start date, and accordingly, it gives you an estimate of when you can really take the test. So you get that certainty. You know how long do you need to prepare, what kind of consistency do you need here. And again, if you want to pick an earlier date, it'll tell you to increase the number of hours per week accordingly. Now, let me tell you this. This is a conservative date. Most people would be done a week and a half to 2 weeks before that. That the hours estimates are a bit more conservative from our side um, in this case. Then again, you have that sequence of preparation. Then it tells you a sectional journey. So you're going to spend November and the rest of December for for verbal. Here again, you can see CR and RC. Then you're going to spend about 7.7 weeks in quant, and then about 4.3 weeks in DI. You can see how those milestones will change. And then at that point, it'll also build you a CR journey over here. Um, as to hey, say, hey, it'll ask you to do cementing in CR first, and then do the CR course. Then in RC, you first have to do the course because your starting ability is not as high. Then do cementing, and then you'll spend about 22 hours to do test readiness, which again is a significant amount of time because you're aiming for a very high ability. Same thing in quant. You can really look at your number properties, algebra, so on and so forth, and then you also have the same journey in DI, and that's available only after you expand all of this, so that we ensure that you understand this here. And now you can go to and understand your DI journey. All right, so hopefully, hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully that will push those of you reaching matters to build a study plan that looks like this. So was that helpful, first of all, to see how to think about your study plan? Okay, and make sure that you have those subsectional plans there for you. Okay. One of the things we want to make sure we do in the Focus edition is to kind of get a very similar record, or even better than what we have on the current edition, where we've delivered 60% of all 700 plus scores in 2023. In fact, that number since January of 2021 has been about 57%, and we have more than 2,000 five-star reviews on GMAT Club. Okay. Also, for those of you who are not connected with me, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or on Reddit. Okay. With that, let's kind of get into the core of this webinar. So what would we do, or what would be the sequence in which we'll do things? We'd first figure out what your current approach to CR questions is, and we'll focus on building pre-think. If you're here, you want to actually learn how to pre-think and get to answers quickly in a much more decisive way in both CR and TPA. We're going to do that. So we'll do this through 3 arguments and a couple of full-length questions. Then we're going to end the session with an assessment of 2 really challenging full-length questions. My goal here would be to ensure to demonstrate how, if you use pre-thinking, you can answer even the most challenging questions, and with a lot of certainty. You can really reject those answer choices which are confusing, with a lot of confidence. And then we'll talk about what should you do next and where can you get more practice. At a very high level, we'll document how you prepared today. We'll recognize what does it take to excel in CR, more specifically in assumptions, and then we'll tell you what your next step should be so that you go on that path towards excellence. Okay. So let's talk about your current approach to critical reasoning. Now, there are 2 ways in which people approach critical reasoning. Let me put in a poll question. Yeah. So here is a but before we do that, I want to make sure you understand what pre-thinking is. Pre-thinking is thinking of one assumption in your mind in about 15 seconds before you look at answer choices. Okay. Now, an argument can have multiple assumptions. Your goal is not to predict what the answer would be. Your goal is to make sure you understand the logic that the author is using. You understand what information has the author provided to justify the conclusion, and it's a litmus test when it comes to pre-thinking to ensure that you can visualize your conclusion. Now, uh, skilled pre-thinkers are able to do pre-thinking in about 15 seconds. When you start pre-thinking, right after the webinar, it may take you even 2 minutes to come up with one potential assumption, and that's okay because you will get better. Another thing that's really important is you need to do pre-thinking before you start looking at answer choices. That's really, really critical. Why? Because answer choices in CR questions, they provide new information, and the moment your brain gets to know of that new information, then it incorporates that as information that's there in the argument, and that actually can hurt you a lot. So pre-thinking is always done before you look at the answer choices overall. Okay. Now, I want to understand from this group, which of the two methodologies do you follow today? There are two ways in which people answer questions. One is they read the argument, they look at the answer choices, do that back and forth till they reach that final candidate. The second is the pre-thinking approach, where they read the argument, they pre-think an answer, and then evaluate the answer choices. In this case, they come back to the argument sparingly only if needed. So which methodology do you follow? One or two? Where are you today? Let's get a few more responses. I have about 85 students in the webinar right now. I have close to 40 responses. 44, 45, 47. Let's get to at least 50. 49. Which methodology do you follow? That's my question. 53 responses. It's wonderful. Let me end the poll, broadcast results. So, but 29 of you follow methodology one, where you do the back and forth, and about 47% or 26 of you who follow methodology two, which is the pre-thinking approach. For those of you who follow methodology one, my goal today would be to make sure that you give pre-thinking a chance, you understand why pre-thinking works and how it will help you get better, how it will help you get better, not only from from essentially getting more CR questions right, but also from the standpoint of reducing the mental friction that builds up in your brain as you answer 5, 6, 7 CR questions, because that back and forth approach, that back and forth does build up a lot of mental friction. And for those of you who are pre-thinkers today, I want to make sure that you get better. I want to make sure that I remove the roadblocks. I want to make sure that you do each step of pre-thinking better so that you get more efficient, so that your timing improves more and more quickly. Okay. Now, pre-thinking is a method, and every method requires that certain prerequisite skills. And in the case of um, assumption question, and in the case of CR in general, you're going to focus on two very critical skills in addition to the method of pre-thinking. The first skill, which I think is absolutely critical in the entire GMAT, regardless of whether we're talking about CRR, CTPA, MSR, and in fact, even GI and TA, is the skill to visualize information. And essentially, visualizing information means that you imagine, when you read a piece of text, you imagine that it's happening in front of you. If that text has excuse me, certain technical terms, you actually open up those technical terms and again imagine them. If there's a word called correlation, you uh, uh, you actually translate that into two entities moving together in the same direction or moving in opposite direction. That one, as one entity changes, the other one should either change in the same direction. If they're correlated, if they're negatively correlated, as one increases, the other one should go down. Okay. Yes, visualization and inference help tremendously in CR and RC. In fact, in every aspect of the GMAT, they would help. That's a core skill that you have to build. Okay. And visualization is particularly useful for the conclusion as well as for the answer choices. Okay. The next thing that's really important over here is to understand, how does the author arrive at the conclusion? How does the author justify the conclusion? What specific aspects does the author use to do that? And this is what we call as the logical structure of the argument. And the third piece that we're going to look at is formulating the falsification question, which is where pre-thinking comes in. Okay. Now, with that, I want to prove to you, if you visualize information, then coming up with assumptions is actually a very natural thing for all human beings. And to prove that, I'm going to give you an argument that each one of you thinks about day in and day out. And here's an argument, and I want you to tell me, what does the author assume here? here is the argument, and I'm going to mute myself for about a minute. All right, I have about 10 answers. Let's get to about 20 answers or so. Um, and you can really see over here what, and I should have actually removed broadcast results. So, many of you are able to get to this point that, hey, you need to get a score higher than 500 to get into an Ivy League. Um, and that I think is critical. And most of you were able to get to this. Why? Because you visualize this in this such an argument day in and day out, because many of you want to get to a top school. Okay. So what does the author do over here? The author presents a fact to you. That's this individual called Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, and then based on this, he makes a claim, a prediction, saying that Joe will not get admission in an Ivy League college. While making that claim, the author makes an assumption saying that a score of 500 for someone like Joe, and that's really important, is unacceptable to Ivy League schools. Now, why is someone like Joe important? Why? Because the author, while making his claim, says that Joe uh, won't get admission into an Ivy League college. He doesn't. He's not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia won't get admission in an Ivy League college. Okay. So with that, I want you to tell me what's the definition of an assumption. What is the definition? So I've removed broadcast results. So type your answers in, press enter. The moment you press enter, I'll get your response. Now you won't see it on the screen, but the system will store it. And when I broadcast results, you're gonna see your response. So what's the definition, the formal definition of an assumption? About 10 responses so far. I want to see quite a few more. It's about 20 here. Please don't put your responses in the Q&A pod. So Akash, don't do that. Please, that's a place for your questions and my answers to your questions, and not your answers to my questions. Yeah, put your answers in the short answer pod on the right, and that's okay, as long as you don't do it again. All right, I have about 16, 17 responses. Let me broadcast results. All right. An assumption is not coming to the conclusion without facts. One's understanding anything that bridges or connects a premise to a conclusion. Okay. A logical statement according to the presented fact. Okay. Uh, an unstated inference. All right. That's actually a sophisticated way to say what an assumption is. I won't use it. It's not a wrong definition, but it's not a very useful definition in terms of uh, yeah. So let's not use the unstated inference, although it's technically correct. Basis for the argument, I believe that is inferred but is not examined. Okay, something what we feel is true. So again, what you see over here is a lot of you, even though you have a feel of for what an assumption is, you don't have a precise definition of what an assumption is, and that's something which is really important. Okay. So an assumption, and this is, I'm going to ask you to write down two things throughout this webinar. This is one of those two things. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. And this is, knowing this definition is really critical. Why? Because if you know this definition and if you truly understand this definition, then through brute force, you can answer every question correctly. This definition is so universal, regardless of the difficulty level of question. If you apply it properly, you'll get to the answer. So an unstated idea that satisfies this essentially one very specific condition. What? That it must be true for the conclusion to be valid. So there's a very specific condition. So let's kind of talk about this here. So a correct assumption has two attributes or two characteristics. The first thing is that it provides new information, which means that this is information that you can't get from the factual part of the argument. Okay. So no facts provide the information that an assumption has. The second thing is it satisfies this one special condition called must be true. And we're going to understand what this must be true is. Now, 99% of the questions evaluate your ability to understand this must be true. About 1%, very few questions evaluate your ability to understand whether an answer choice provides new information or not. Um, the harder ones essentially are over here. Okay. So, yeah, there were a couple of questions earlier that just came in. One was actually one came in earlier. It says, "I'm actually using pre-thinking. I'm taking about 2.5 minutes to get to medium and hard questions, and how can I reduce the time?" First of all, 2.5 minutes is a really good starting point. If you're able to apply pre-thinking consistently in that time, that's good. Now, what will it take to reduce that time? You're going to address that in about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Okay. So the second question, Gokul says, "I'm an e-GMAT who's completed the CR course. I'm in the hard cementing phase. Will this webinar be helpful for me?" Gokul, great question. Thank you. So the second part of this webinar in about 40 minutes is going to be helpful for you. Another thing that would be helpful is the coffee session that Pyle and I did with you guys last Friday. So if you have the recording for that, then definitely go make sure you go through the cementing phase. If you don't have it, just write to me and then we'll share the recording with you. Okay. But yeah, if you join back in about 40 minutes, you're going to find it a lot more useful for you when we get to the harder questions. Okay. So at e-GMAT, we like to visualize everything, and I want to make sure you understand that must be true aspect through visualization. So what does this mean? So think of this entire argument as this house with the roof as the conclusion, and these three supporting statements that are pillars that make the conclusion upright, that prevent the conclusion from prevent the roof from caving in. Now let's assume we actually, let's call these pillars 1, 2, and 3. Now let's remove pillar 1. If the roof still stays upright, then essentially pillar 1 was a strengthener. It wasn't an assumption. Yes, has the roof been weakened as we remove pillar 1? Absolutely. But did the roof cave in? Absolutely not. So pillar 1, not an assumption, but a strengthener. And why is this understanding important? Why? Because for those of you who practice assumption questions, you see those tempting answer choices which are incorrect, but often mislead you. Those tempting answer choices, more often than not, are strengtheners but not assumption. In other words, every assumption is a strengthener. A strengthener is a superset. Every strengthener is not an assumption. Okay. Uh, if you remove pillar 3, the roof still doesn't cave in, which means pillar 3 is also not an assumption. Now let's bring all of them back. Let's remove pillar 2. As you remove pillar 2, the roof caves in, which is kind of what the definition of an assumption is. It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. So pillar 2 is an essential pillar. It's really important. So that is kind of what the assumption does. Okay. And we're going to really take examples, actual examples, where we talk about what is equivalent to pillar 1 and 3 and what is equivalent to pillar 2. Or what does must be true mean? It means that if the information provided by assumption is not true, there are means that using which I can break or invalidate the conclusion. Why? Because as per the definition, the assumption must be there for the conclusion to remain valid. Okay. Now, let's kind of apply this to all of this here. So same argument. Let's say let's apply that must be true aspect. So what does falsification of conclusion mean? It means that if Joe gets into an Ivy League school with that score of 500, then my conclusion will be destroyed. Okay. Now, how do we evaluate whether the answer choice that we've chosen is correct? How do we evaluate its must be true aspect? Let's look at the answer choice that we said is correct. Now, this was the answer choice that we said is correct. A score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League schools. Now, the question that we have to ask is, will Joe get admission if this statement no longer holds true? Okay. Now, here is something that you must understand. If when we say that a statement doesn't hold true. By definition, what we are saying is its negated version holds true. So when we say that a score of 500 on the GMAT is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges, it's not true. It's not a must be true. What we are really saying is that a score of 500 for someone like Joe becomes acceptable to Ivy League schools. Now, does my conclusion break down when this happens? Absolutely. Why? Because if my conclusion, if a score of 500 becomes acceptable, then I, as an author, cannot say with 100% certainty that Joe will not get admission in an Ivy League college. Okay, that's something which is really critical here. Okay. Again, this is what a statement not true means. Now, many of you may say, Rajat, how can you say that if I say a statement's not true, then its negated version becomes true? Okay, let's take some examples here. Here's a statement that says Harvard has the best MBA program. If you say that statement is not true, then aren't you saying that Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or an MBA program that's just as good as Harvard or even better than Harvard exists? Right? When you say this statement is not true, aren't you saying this part here? Yes, no? Right? So when you say a statement is not true, not necessarily true, what you're really saying is there's a possibility that its negated version is true. John runs faster than David. When you say that's not true, essentially what you're really saying is that David is just as fast as John, or David could even be faster than John, right? You say this is not true. So this is kind of really, really essential. When you say something's not must be true, you're essentially saying something else is true, or the possibility of something else being true as well. Okay. Now, where does this must be true come? It comes from the very definition of an assumption. Now, it also works the other way. When you look at an incorrect answer choice and you really say, hey, this is not must be true, what you're really saying is, regardless of that statement, nothing's going to happen to my conclusion. Now, let's kind of take a couple of incorrect answer choices. Okay, same argument, we take this answer choice. A score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. Now, let's evaluate if this statement is must be true. So you want to really figure out, well, conclusion become invalid if this statement is no longer true, which means what happens if this statement is no longer true? The score of 500 becomes a good score. The score of 500 becomes a good score, then does Joe get admission? Absolutely not. Why? Because let's look at the argument. The argument's not predicated on what you call the score 500. In fact, this even if this number were changed from 500 to 700, the logic of the argument would remain the same. What the logic is that Joe hasn't scored enough to warrant an admission into an Ivy League school. Okay. Let's look at another answer choice. The quality of an applicant's essays does not play a significant role in deciding whether he gets into an Ivy League college. Let's ask ourselves, is this must be true? Will Joe get admission if this statement is no longer true? Okay. Now, if this statement is no longer true, then what happens? This statement becomes true. The quality of an applicant's essays does play a significant role. Now, will Joe get admission if the essays start to become important? Absolutely not. Why? Because it doesn't matter. Those essays won't matter if Joe doesn't get cross the minimum threshold for the GMAT. Okay. So again, this was just a brief summary of what an assumption is, what the must be true aspect of an assumption is. We use a very simple argument so that I could explain that. But we will essentially use the same process on extremely complex arguments. And you're going to really see how we apply this process regardless of the sophistication of the argument remains the same. Okay. Shivani has this question. Says, I'm an e-GMAT. I could solve medium cementing questions, but in the hard, I felt time was a major factor. Okay. So in that case, if you feel time was the major factor, you have relaxed cementing. Do that. Okay. You've got to understand. So, or, wait for another 20 minutes and we'll talk about how do you address how your timing improves. But Shivani, if you feel time is the only factor, if you were able to sail through medium cementing, then definitely do relaxed cementing, relaxed timing for hard quizzes. And if you think you can hit the thresholds over there, then absolutely you are on your journey. Okay. Now, must be true is really, really important. That understanding of must be true helps you get to the correct answer. When you evaluate that must be true aspect, you'll figure out that the conclusion breaks down for the correct answer. For the incorrect answer, the conclusion continues to hold through. In fact, nothing happens to the conclusion. And regardless of the complexity of the argument or the answer choice, this principle will always, always, always play out. Okay. Now, with that, we've gone through the foundation. We're going to really do a pre-thinking exercise, a warm-up marathon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an argument, a more complex argument. There will be no answer choices. I want you to tell me what the assumption is in this short answer pod. We'll record your answers, and I'm going to approach pre-thinking in my way. We're going to look at how I build the logical structure, how I visualize the conclusion, how I ask the falsification question, and as I ask the falsification question, how do we arrive at pre-thinking? So you're going to be able to do a differential analysis of how you approach versus how I approach, and then we're going to really move forward, practice a couple of other questions so that we cement our approach towards CR questions. All right. So are you guys ready? Do you have a pen and paper with you? Let me clear the prior answers. Perfect. I'm going to remove broadcast results. Here is the argument. Good luck, guys. I'm going to mute myself for about 2 minutes. Again, type in your answers and type in your answers, press enter. I'll have the answer, but you won't see it on your screen, and that's okay. All right, guys, get those answers in. I have about 6 answers so far. Press enter so I get those answers. About 8. Get a few more responses. Come on. 9, 10. Let's get a few more responses. All you have to do is tell me what does the author assume here. 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to broadcast results. Again, I have about 81 of you here. If you are here, the best way for you to make the most out of your time is by participating. So make sure you participate. That way you get feedback on what you're doing. Okay. I see a couple of answers that are that essentially describe the argument. There are a couple that are strengtheners, not essentially assumptions. And there are a couple that actually are okay assumptions, but they're extremely simplistic overall. So, and I see 1 or 2 that are good responses here. Okay, so let's kind of look at this in this case. So Let's first talk about the process that we're going to do. The first thing, which in any CR question, is you've got to isolate the conclusion. You've got to understand and visualize the conclusion, and that's absolutely critical. Why? Because as you visualize the conclusion, you assign numbers to it, and once you understand what the conclusion is, you then are able to do a much better job understanding the reasoning or the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. And when you do that, then just building that pre-thinking question or that falsification question that we call it, that becomes fairly simple. And when you do this, then the assumptions become very simple. So essentially, um, in the context of pre-thinking, what's critical is this and this: visualizing the conclusion, building that logical structure. When you do that, this and this should be automatic, more or less. If you do a good job in 1 and 2, 3 and 4 are more or less a process step. They don't require a lot of gray matter. Okay. Now, what is this falsification question that I've been talking about? This falsification question comes from that very definition of an assumption, which is what? An unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. So, in other words, if we were to translate this, um, essentially, your assumption is built around those scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Why? Because the job of a of of an assumption is to prevent the conclusion from breaking down. So if you think about building that house, putting that roof, if you were to think about putting pillars, the first question you're going to ask is, where is my roof caving in? That's where you're going to put pillars. So if you want to figure out what an assumption is, you have to find scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Why? Because if you figure out those scenarios where the conclusion breaks down, then your assumptions simply are that such scenarios are not possible. Okay. So your pre-thinking, your falsification question is, under what circumstances, given the information in the argument, um, does the conclusion break down? Okay. Can you please clarify the difference between an assumption and a premise? Oh, sure. Let me just write it down over here. A premise, in other words, anything that's mentioned in the argument, and that's supposed the conclusion, which means it's a strengthener. Okay. In other words, if I were to say an assumption hidden and is a hidden and essential premise. Hidden in the sense because it's not mentioned, you can't infer it from the logical part of the argument. RB, does that help you understand the difference between a premise and an assumption? Okay, so all right. This is the second thing that I want you to write down. And this is the falsification question, regardless of the argument, whether it's a causal, a predictive argument, whether the author is making a prediction about what's going to happen in the future or explaining what has happened, the falsification question is going to remain the same. So two things you need to write down. One's the definition of an assumption. Second is the structure of the falsification question. Okay. Now let's start with this argument itself. Okay. I want you to tell me which of these three statements is the main conclusion of the argument. Let me put in a poll question. Which statement here is the main conclusion? All right, I have about 27, 40. Which statement is the main conclusion? 47 answers. Let's get to a few more responses. Let's get to 50. I have about 80 students here in the webinar. 52 answers. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. But half the class is right. Statement two is indeed the main conclusion. That statement says clearly the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system of the former. In other words, what the author is saying is, let's blame the reward system for this finding. Okay, there are those that essentially chose statement one as the conclusion. Why? Because they see this word concludes. Okay. There are people who chose statement three as the main conclusion. Why? Because okay, right? People who chose statement three because they said this is towards the end. That's kind of how typical arguments are. So I'm going to choose statement three as my main conclusion, right? Now let's talk about why is this. So the main conclusion is essentially the idea, the core idea that the author wants to convey through this argument. The author in any argument, the very definition of an argument is that you're trying to make a point. When you look at um, uh, 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 this entire argument, statement two is the one that the author wants to. It's a core idea that the author wants to further. Now, statement one is a conclusion made by this research paper. It's not the conclusion that's made by the author. So, statement one cannot be the main conclusion. People who chose statement one, is that clear? Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about statement three. So whenever you see two statements and you're confused between them, which one's the main conclusion, which one's not, you have to ask yourself, why is that statement written? Is statement three written to make statement two more believable, or is statement two written to make statement three more believable? And when you ask yourself, this is what we call as the ABC test, what you're going to find is that three is written to make two more believable. So let's kind of understand this. Three says the criterion for rewarding tenured faculty places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. Why does the author say this? To actually justify statement number two, which is what? The difference between professors and lecturers is because of the reward system for the former. Okay. People who chose statement three, do you now know why three is not the conclusion? Why? Because it's used to justify two, which means two is the core idea that the author wants to promote through this argument. Okay. What's the definition of an assumption? Can we recite the definition, the core definition of an assumption? Okay. Yes, the first person, number one, the person who says unstated idea must be true for the conclusion to be valid. It need not be a fact, just to be very clear. It could be a claim as well. It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Okay. So, Shashweta, hopefully that helps. What is a statement called that strengthens the conclusion? It's a strengthener. Okay. All right. So now I want to ask you another question. Now I'm going to clear the mess that I made here on this slide so that we have this. And this is where understanding the argument's really important. Okay. So let me bring this up here. Whose reward system does statement three talk about? Is it just tenured faculty, just lecturers, both tenured faculty and lecturers, or neither? Whose reward system does statement 3 talk about? Yeah. I have 30 answers, 37, 38, 40, 45, 3, 2, and 1. Upwards of 50 answers. That's wonderful. Let's broadcast results. You can see 65% of these are correct, who chose only tenured faculty or just tenured faculty. But 30% of you chose both of them, and uh, about 6% of you chose just lecturers. So let's look at this. A lot of people think it's both because of this word greater over here, um, that we see, this word greater. Now, remember, statement 3 just talks about tenured faculty. It says the criterion for rewarding tenured faculty places greater emphasis on research than on teaching. What it means is, for tenured faculty, maybe there's a 70% emphasis on research, and maybe there's a 30%, always which translate comparatives into numbers so that you can visualize it. There's a 30% emphasis on teaching. Okay, a greater emphasis on on research than on teaching. We don't know anything about the reward criteria for lecturers. Is that clear? And Candy, you'll get a recording of this webinar on the platform as well as also in an email. So if you go back, log into the platform, you'll get a recording as well. Okay. Is this clear? This greater is comparing the emphasis on research than on teaching just for tenured faculty, just for these guys over here. Okay. Don't make a mistake like this, because this is what will lead you to get a question wrong despite doing everything right. Okay. Can't we consider it in a reverse way, that for faculty, or you mean for lecturers, the emphasis is more on teaching? Absolutely not. Let's kind of take another argument here, just to make sure. In terms of, now, again, I know I don't have two entities here, but if I look at these two statements, okay, can I assume this? No, absolutely not. What's not there cannot be assumed or inferred. Okay. And these are skills you need to build, just to be very frank. Okay. So let's visualize the conclusion. The conclusion says the difference between the professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system for the former. So essentially, what it's saying is that, hey, we've got to bring the prior statement here, and tenure professors only help 40% of the students improve significantly, whereas full-time lecturers help 70% of the students improve significantly. And the reason for that is the reward system over here. So the reason for this is the reward system for the tenured faculty. Okay. right? So that's your main conclusion. This statement over here, number 3, the supporting statement is written to justify the conclusion, and the first statement is the context that sets the argument. Okay. Now, with that, let's kind of look at the pre-thinking question here. The pre-thinking question is, under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, would the conclusion break down? This pre-thinking question has two parts. Part 1, which is given the facts and the argument, and part 2, which is the conclusion breakdown criteria. And we're going to get both of these from the argument. And in every argument, these are the only two fill in the blanks that you'll have to put in. Under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible? This is part 2. And this also over here is 2. Can you see a mapping of conclusion breakdown criteria to the reward system not being responsible? Can you see this over here? If the reward system is not responsible, then my conclusion breaks down, right? Because that's what the author is saying. Okay. Now, what's part 1 and part 1? Given the facts in the argument, that's part 1. And these are the facts in the argument here. Okay. This is part 2. Here, conclusion breakdown criteria. And this is the translation of that conclusion breakdown criteria. Clear to everyone? Facts over here, conclusion breakdown criteria over here. And for those of you who are also going through a quant course, you can really see the same translation skill in some ways is applicable here. Okay. So let's kind of look at this. Under what circumstances can the reward system not be responsible or cannot cause the difference between these two, tenured and non-tenured, given that we know that the reward system for tenured places greater emphasis on research than on teaching. So in other words, given that 70% of the reward system for tenured is for research, 30% is for teaching. In what scenario can we not blame the reward system to cause the difference? What if the non-tenured faculty has identical reward, which means that the reward system for tenured versus non-tenured, there's no difference between the reward system for either one? Then in that case, can we blame the reward system? No, if both entities have the same reward system, they have the same incentive, and one produces better results than the other, then you can't blame the incentive structure. The blame has to be with the entities or the inputs that the entities are working with. Okay. Now, what if the reward system were there, but most tenured faculty didn't care about the reward system? Okay. So what if that happens? In that case also, yes, there is a greater emphasis on research than on teaching, but that's not what governs their behavior. That's not what governs where they put their energy. If that's something that's there, then in that case also, we can't blame the reward system. Now, if these are scenarios in which my conclusion breaks down, so what are my assumptions? Non-tenured faculty does not have an identical reward system, and most tenured professors should care about the reward system. That's really, really important here. Okay. Now, can you see how, as we went systematically, we were able to come up with this, the falsification scenarios? And again, it all comes from the definition of must be true to visualizing the conclusion and understanding the logical structure to then really figuring out what my falsification scenarios should be. You make that journey and you're going to be able to get to the correct answer every time. In the next 3 or 4 questions, I'm going to demonstrate how this process works on every argument, regardless of how challenging it is. Okay. Now, if the rewards, I have seen the statement here, if the reward system for tenured professors reward tenured professors for teaching and not for research, you can't go against the facts and the argument. Remember, in a CR question, the facts and the argument are something that you can't argue against. If the author tells you the sun goes around the earth as a fact in the argument, you've got to take it as a fact. You're not going to dispute the author. Okay. Shivani says, What if we cannot think of those pre-thinking part immediately? First of all, you only have to come up with one assumption, Helen, not multiple assumptions. I am doing a much more exhaustive thing because I want to show you what all can come. Even if you come up with one, what essentially you will have proven is that you understand the logic of the author. And then as you evaluate the answer choices, if you understand the logic that the author is using, the moment you see another correct answer, you will be able to understand that this answer choice also breaks my conclusion down, or the negation of this answer choice also breaks my conclusion down, and you'd be able to select that. Okay. The core thing is to visualize the conclusion, to build that logical structure. And pre-thinking is just a very, very small step from that point. Shivani says, to clarify, timing was an issue since I took time for pre-thinking. Seems like I'm struggling here. Shivani, again, if you don't visualize the argument, that's the only time you're going to take time for pre-thinking. Because other than that, you're able to visualize the conclusion and the argument, then pre-thinking is simply fill in the blanks. It's nothing else. Elizabeth says, how do we identify the conclusion? Again, Elizabeth, if you're an e-GMAT or premise and conclusion file to actually the entire premise and conclusion module is devoted to it, to helping you identify the conclusion. The core idea over here is what's the one idea that the author wants to convey through this argument. That statement is what the conclusion is. Sometimes that statement is outside the argument in the question stem, but the statement's always there. How pre-thinking will help in inference questions? Again, not a topic of this session. Guys, let's not go there. I don't want to go into evaluate, strengthen, weaken, because then we're going to go on a tangent. Okay. But again, all of that's there in the course. Now, how many of you are thinking, man, this took very long? How many of you are thinking of that? But will what help? Pre-thinking? Oh, it will. Absolutely. Okay, pre-thinking and time. And how many of you are worried about it? How many of you are not worried about it? If you're not worried, then say no. If you're worried about it, say me or yes. Either one would work. I'm used to it, so not worried. Okay, that's good. Quite a few of you who are worried. There are some of you who are not worried. Okay. Now, again, first thing, we wouldn't have the success if pre-thinking didn't work. Okay. And everyone includes pretty much every company that's out there. So there's a factual piece out there, and all of this data is there on GMAT Club. GMAT Club does a really good job of cataloging the reviews by date. So if you go on, click on any company's review, they are all organized chronologically, so you can go back in time to the count. And one page has about 10 reviews. So if you go back 5 pages, you can see the timeline over there. You get a very good estimate. Okay. Also, the 5-star reviews over there. But here is how your pre-thinking journey would be. If you're an e-GMAT, you've probably gone through this journey, or you're going through this journey. So let's say, this is a sophisticated graph, especially those of you who want to go through the GFE, this is going to be helpful for you. On the y-axis, we have the accuracy level. So the higher you go on y-axis, the higher accuracy is. On the x-axis, and again, it's for a question of a very similar difficulty, we have time to answer questions. So the further right you go, the longer you take to answer questions. Now, as you start pre-thinking, let's say you're starting at this point over here where your time to answer questions is medium, your accuracy is in that low bracket. The first thing you're going to observe is that A, you take longer, and B, you answer more questions correctly. So you can really see we're going on the right on the y-axis, we're going vertically up on the accuracy axis. Okay. How many of you have observed this? Okay. This is good. This is a natural process. And that's something that is going to happen to everyone who's learning something new. When you learn a new skill, whether you're learning a new shot in tennis, whether you're learning a new exercise, whether you're learning a new way to code, whether you're learning a new documentation process, whether you're learning a new program management skill, there are two things that are going to happen. Every step takes longer, and your accuracy, the error rate, should go down. And you should have experienced this, right? Those who've learned new things. And it goes on if you're doing things the right way and you take longer. That's because essentially your brain's not used to doing things this way. So you're using the conscious part of the brain to go through the steps. And when you're using the conscious part, you have to tell, I'm going to do this next, I'm going to do this next. And then when you have to do this, you take longer. You're not doing this subconsciously. Okay. Um, and as you do this more and more and more, your brain, those your neurons, the connections between neurons become stronger, and your speed improves. So this is what happens as you take this journey from 2 to 3. Your accuracy goes up. You can really see we're going to go going further up on y-axis, but your time to answer questions, that has gone down. In fact, it's less than what it was when you started. This is what I call as the pre-thinking hysteresis. Once you get to point number 3, you never look back. Okay. And then as you continue to do pre-thinking, you're going to do it even faster. Your accuracy is going to go up even higher. And that's kind of where you really say, I now understand how I can get to that 90th percentile ability. Okay. Now, why is it that you initially take longer? And why is it that your time goes down? Now, you take longer initially because you're trying to visualize arguments for the first time, and you're trying to translate those statements into those comparisons into numbers. If you're not used to doing that, you're going to take longer. Okay. And as you do that, uh, when you think about the structures of arguments that exist, there are only so many structures that exist. There are only so many ways to make the comparison. So 1 to 2 is doing this for the first time. 2 to 3 is when you start seeing repeats of that. Those visualizations happen a lot more quickly, and the accuracy improves, because as you go from 1 to 2, which is where, Adnan, your question comes in, where you say, I'm worried I'm going to get the wrong assumptions. You're going to get some wrong assumptions going from 1 to 2, and in fact, even going from 2 to 3. But then with every wrong assumption, which is where, as you have a comprehensive answer choice, it'll tell you where you made a mistake. You're going to correct yourself. That's where those neuron connections will become stronger. Okay. So the more you give yourself feedback, the more you go slow from 1 to 2, and in fact, even from 2 to 3, the faster you would answer questions. And this seems like an oxymoron, but it isn't. Why? Because going slow means consciously building those connections, and essentially, once those connections are built, you can no longer go slow. Has anyone tried to walk slow? Walk slowly? Yes. Does it take more effort than walking at your normal pace? You try and walk slowly. Does it take more effort? Why? You're going slow, right? Why does it take more effort? It shouldn't. What does habit mean? Explain that term habit. What does used to mean? Why? Because essentially, if you look at the physics of it, you're using less energy when you're going slow, right? It's the connection of neurons. Your brain has to tell your legs to go slow. It has to be put in the conscious part. Whereas on the subconscious part, uh, essentially, if you're walking at your normal pace, then your brain doesn't have to send those signals. Your legs know what's the regular pace in which you have to go. Your body is used to processing and creating. Your heart's used to pumping at a regular pace and generating a certain amount of energy. Okay, so bottom line is, once um, pre-thinking becomes a natural part of it, you'll actually have to put an effort to go slow, and which, by the way, you won't do because it's not beneficial to you. Does that make sense? Here are a few folks. Alok, who actually got a 740, says, understand the passage. Equally important, pre-think and answer before looking at the answer choice. This one word will have the most impact on your GMAT score. In the world of GFE, that's even more applicable. Here's a guy who got a 770, improved from I think a 30th percentile to a 97th percentile in CR in 20 days just because he started doing pre-thinking. And then he said, answer CR questions as if there are no answer choices. Here's a guy who improved from 520 to 740. And he tells you why you should do pre-thinking here. And where he says, apart from comprehending the passage, we keep on speculating in which direction the passage, this is the RC aspect of pre-thinking, will orient, or what logical jump has the author taken. Okay. Again, it's really important to go through this journey because this is the process of you building new neural connections, you building new skills, and you building that ability to get to that higher score. All right, with that, we're going to solve one more question and then we're going to solve a TPA question. Are you guys ready? And this is a question which truly, truly will tell you the value of pre-thinking. It will tell you why you should do pre-thinking and if you the value of that definition of an assumption. All right. Here is the poll for this particular question. As the question. Good luck, guys. I'm going to mute myself. You have about 2 minutes and 20 seconds for this. All right, guys, get those answers in. 5, 4, 3. Come on. I just have about 43, 44 responses. I want to get 50. 4 and oh sorry, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. What was it? I was just looking at counting the number of responses here. Okay, so we have close to 48. I think it's 48 responses overall. So we can see choice E, most popular choice B, really popular, choice D was popular, as well as choice A. That's interesting. I haven't had choice A. I haven't had this many people choose choice A in a very, very long time. So that's very, very interesting overall. How did you guys find this question? And by the way, is the audio coming through loud and clear? I just want to make sure that's the case. Okay, easy, easy. All right. No one was confused in the answer choices? I hope it's pre-thinking. It does shrink the potential pool of answer choices, but we call it pre-thinking. I thought B and E were correct. Yes, B and E are confusing. In this question, you have 4 strengtheners. B, C, D, and E are all strengtheners. Only one of them is an assumption. All right. There's only one assumption, not multiple. And this is a great question to really understand that must be true aspect of it. Let's kind of go with this. So the question statement tells you what the conclusion is. Which of the following is an assumption on which the highway commissioner's claim depends? So essentially, the claim is about is where the commissioner's claim is what the conclusion is. We have to figure out what does the commissioner assume while making that claim. Okay. So what's the claim that the commissioner makes? The commissioner says the increase in toll will increase the annual revenue generated by the highway by at least 50% per year. Okay. So what it means is if last year my revenue was $1 million, then this year the revenue will be at least 1.51, or let's call it $1.6 million. At least a 50% increase. Just visually doing this. Okay. Now, how do we estimate annual revenue? Why don't you tell me? How do we estimate annual revenue as per this argument? Okay, that's good. Toll times the total distance traveled on the highway, miles times the toll. Annual revenue is toll per mile, okay, toll per mile multiplied by total number of toll miles traveled on the highway. Everyone's okay with this? Does this make sense? And how do we get this? Because we know we're charging on a per mile basis. We have a 10 cents toll per mile in the argument. Everyone can see this. Any doubts on this? Yes, no. Times the number of vehicles? No. Where are the number of vehicles in this argument? You're charging money on per mile traveled. A car travels 100 miles. You're going to charge, the cost per mile times 100. If 2 cars travel 10 miles each, you're going to charge 10 times the cost per mile for each of them. So essentially, the total number of toll miles is where cars are already built in over here. Can you, for those of you who are looking at the number of vehicles, can you see how total number of toll miles already has cars built in? Average distance travel, number of cars, cost per mile. That also works. Yes, you can really total number. This is essentially your average distance travel multiplied by total number of cars is essentially your total number of toll miles. Everyone can see this. Okay. Now, let's do a pre-thinking. We've not seen the answer choices. What we have is just the argument. Now, what we know over here is that this toll per mile will go up by at least 50%. Increase by. Now, under what circumstances will the annual revenue not go up by 50%, provided that we know that toll per mile has increased by 50%? What are the circumstances in which the annual revenue will not go up by 50%? What are the circumstances? If we know that the toll per mile has already increased by 50%. If the total number of toll miles go down, that's the only scenario, right? So my assumption is that the total number of miles traveled does not go down. That's my assumption. And good use of the annotation. I really like that. Is this assumption clear? Is this assumption clear? Everyone, is this clear? Yes, no? Come on, I have 70 of you. I want to see a few more yeses. Okay, let's look at choice B. A lot of you chose choice B. It was the second most popular choice. Let's go back to our responses. This is how you guys polled. 11 of you chose choice B. Okay, choice B says the total number of trips made on the toll highway will not decrease from the current level. Now, what's the definition of an assumption? What's the definition of an assumption? It is an unstated idea required for the conclusion to be true. Now, if the average number of trips, if the number of trips goes down, if let's say last year we had 1,000 trips, last year we had 1,000, and this year we have, actually we should do 1,000, and this year we have 950. Does it mean that the total number of miles traveled on the toll highway will go down if this year we have 950? Does it mean that? No. What could compensate for fewer trips? What could compensate for fewer trips? Longer trips. Yes. Okay. Okay. So is this must be true? Is this must be true then? Does it satisfy the must be true criteria? No, right? People who chose choice B, do you have a better understanding of what must be true is now? Remember that essential pillar. You don't, choice B is an excellent strengthener, but it's not an essential pillar. People who chose choice B, do you understand where you made a mistake, why you made a mistake, and how you're going to avoid making this mistake again? All right. Let's look at a correct answer. About half of you, 47% of the class chose the correct answer, which is the total distance travel will not go down from what it was last year or from the current level. If we falsify that, then does it mean that the total number of miles will decrease? Yes, total distance is the same as total number of miles. So is that a must be true? Absolutely, which is what makes this the correct option. Let's look at choice C. Choice C talks about the average length of the trip. If the average length of the trip goes down, what can compensate for that? What can offset the reduction in length of trip? More trips, right? Again, not must be true. Again, an excellent strengthener, not a must be true. Okay. People who chose choice A, again, is the claim about the fact that you'll have enough money to finance road repairs? Absolutely not. The claim is purely about increasing the annual revenue generated by the toll highway by at least 50% overall. Okay. All right. So what did you guys learn from this? What are your key learnings? You've got to do pre-thinking, yes. What else? Understanding the definition of must be true is important. Focus on nuances, absolutely. Again, we saw the second and the third passage, and both of them, the nuances were important. It's not about good or bad. It's about some people have a longer way than others. Again, don't judge yourself based on the questions in this session. The questions in this session are all 700 level. Option A, isn't that a likely scenario? No. Doesn't matter if it's a likely or unlikely scenario, Usman. Usman says, can we please go through option A again? Yes. Option A talks about the amount of money required to for road repairs. Okay, whether that will go up or not. Do we care about the amount of money required in the context of this argument? This is a 700 level question. Yeah, 47% of you got it right. That makes it a 700 level question. Okay. Now, coming back to option A, do we care about the amount of money required? No, that's not what the commissioner is claiming. The commissioner is claiming I'm going to increase the revenue by 50%. If your boss says, hey, reduce the cost by 15% and I'm going to give you a $10,000 bonus, and if you reduce the cost by 16%, and then your boss can no longer say, oh, we're not going through a profit, so I can't give you a bonus. No, that wasn't the condition that he gave you. He gave you a 15% reduction in bonus, a 15% reduction in cost, sorry. Okay. Oh, thank you, Usman. Okay. So what is challenging about this question? Um, Again, revenue profits, nothing is important here in the context of this. This question is all about the claim made by the commissioner. Okay. What's important here? It's about understanding what must be true means, and in that context, you've got to visualize what these answer choices are saying. So that's really, really important. And the reason why I want to make sure that that's important is because, again, each and every hard question is going to test the same skills, and you can solve countless questions, but unless and until you build those skills, you're not going to get to that 90th percentile. Okay. Now, I want to give you a TPA question, a two-part analysis question. It's a CR-based TPA, so it's not an RC-based TPA overall. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give you an argument, and in this argument, you'll have to find an assumption to the argument and something that supports that assumption. Okay, so that's something that is required. I'm going to put the options here. Let me put in the options. Where are my polls here? And then here is the option that there's the choice that strengthens the assumption. Okay. And for you to be able to read this properly, um, here is your argument here. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. You guys have about 3 minutes to answer this question. 3 minutes. And again, it's the same set of choices. One of them is the assumption. The other one strengthens that assumption. All right, you guys have another 20 seconds. Get those answers in. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to end this poll as well. And I'm going to broadcast results for both of them. So this is a two-part analysis question. For those of you who don't know what TPA is, it's a part of data insights. It's also a part of your integrated reasoning section. So regardless of whether you want to take the current edition or the focus edition, you'll have to deal with these questions. It's just that the importance of these questions is more if you're taking the focus edition, is not as much. It doesn't count towards your score out of 800 if you're taking the current edition. All right. So how did this question feel? How was this question? Everything felt right. Confusing. Okay, moderate. It's a new format. It's a new template. You've got to really train your brain to look at it. And you can really see, depending on where you're coming from, for some of you, it's much easier than the others, which is why I always say don't try and judge a question, because what may be easy for you may be very challenging for someone else. Okay. This is, again, a 700 level question. Okay. RB says, is there a danger of pre-thinking? Perhaps you may have misread or fallen for a trap. Absolutely, that can happen, that you may misread or fall for a trap, but then that's going to happen regardless of whether you do pre-thinking or not. Remember, pre-thinking is nothing but processing on what you've read. If you've read something wrong, then regardless of whether you do pre-thinking wrong or whether you don't do pre-thinking, you're going to carry on that wrong impression and evaluate the answer choices. Okay. So that's something which is there. Now, the value of pre-thinking is that if you read something wrong, you get to the wrong understanding. You at least focus on visualizing the conclusion. And then let's say you read the conclusion wrong, you would know when you read the solution that your visualization was wrong, and you're going to correct that behavior. You're going to really figure out uh, uh, where you went wrong, and then you're going to correct that. And that's a really important thing. Now, without pre-thinking, you're not going to spend time on visualizing the conclusion. You're not going to be able to identify that mistake, and you're going to continue making that mistake. Okay, so that's something that's there. So that danger isn't with pre-thinking. It's actually about uh, 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 it's about reading incorrectly. Pre-thinking exposes your gap, or gaps for that matter. But good question, RB. Again, you won't have 60% of 700 plus scores if pre-thinking didn't work. So let's kind of focus on this. Let's visualize the conclusion. The conclusion says we believe the strike's inevitable. What does that mean? It means that no matter what happens, we're going to have a strike. That's something that there's no way to avoid the strike. Okay. Now, you guys should remember the argument by now, but if you don't remember the argument, I'm going to actually share the argument over here at the bottom. Let's make this bigger. I'm going to bring in my notes pod here. Here is the argument. It's at the bottom. Can you guys see the argument? Okay. All right. So let's look at the structure of the argument. So what's going on here? The workers here, they have a couple of demands. They want to increase the pay. They want this lunch break, and they want certain people to be hired. So they essentially have have these demands here, and then we're given the context with regards to the financial situation that Faxum has, and it's not great. And based on that, the author is saying that strike's going to happen. The strike's inevitable. Okay. Okay. Can you really see and that's kind of the simplified structure of the argument, right? Okay. We have these demands, bad situation and financially, and based on that, we say, hey, a strike's going to happen. All right. So, what's the pre-thinking question? The pre-thinking question, again, for the assumption is absolutely similar. It's identical. It says, under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, will the conclusion break down? Okay. Translation means, what's the conclusion breakdown scenario? Is there a scenario in which we can prevent the strike? Why? Because the conclusion says the strike's inevitable. So the breakdown condition is that we can prevent the strike, given the fact that we know the demands of workers, given that Faxum has a ton of losses over the last 1 year. Is the translation of this question here? Conclusion breakdown, preventing the strike, facts in the argument, demands of workers, and then Faxum has that 3/4. Can you see the translation 1:1? Same process. Very clear? Good. And again, ask yourself this question. If you make a mistake doing this, it's not because you're doing pre-thinking, it's just because you're reading wrong. Right? There's no rocket science here. Now, how can we prevent the strike given the demands of workers and given that Faxum is 3/4? Okay, there are a few ways. One is, if Faxum can figure out how to get enough money to satisfy these demands, okay, in that case, there won't be a strike. Okay, that's the way to prevent the strike. Or if, despite the demands, workers actually kind of scale back their demands, they really say, hey, we don't care about the demands. Okay, so if they don't proceed with the threat despite Faxum being unable to meet the demands. Okay, now each one of these has certain assumptions. So if the assumption is that there's no way Faxum can get enough money, or either by raising a loan or just by looking at its cash coffer, or the other way is that, the other assumption is that workers will definitely go on a strike if their demands are not met. Okay, falsification scenarios and assumptions clear? A few more yeses, guys. Okay. So for each of these assumptions, okay, that's a great point. We're going to address the willingness piece. Faxum does not have enough money or cannot get enough money to satisfy the demand. What would strengthen this assumption? Remember, the second part of the question is you've got to strengthen that assumption. So what could strengthen this assumption? The first part, what would strengthen this assumption is, that if we know that most of their cash reserves are gone, or if we know that banks are not willing to actually give money to Faxum, or if the current cash reserves are so low that they can barely meet their current expenses, forget about the increased expenses because of the demand. Workers will go on a strike. What would strengthen that? If workers have a history of following up with their threats, or if workers will continue to get compensated if there's a law that states that they'll continue to get money despite going on a strike. Either all of these would strengthen that. Okay. Now let's look at answer choice A, willing to compromise with respect to the paid lunch piece. Now, what does this choice really say? Let's whenever you evaluate an answer choice, you always have to translate it into simplified terms. What this is really saying is the workers will compromise on one aspect of their demands. Okay. Now, this actually is a weakener, as someone said. It's a weakener. Can a weakener ever be an assumption? Absolutely not. Can it be a strengthener for that assumption? Absolutely not. Okay. Choice B says when the leaders call for a strike, members go for it. Essentially, members follow leaders. Now, do we know if the leaders have called for a strike as per the argument? No, not really. Okay, again, choice thesis, Faxam is unwilling to negotiate. Should Faxam be willing to negotiate? What does willingness to do something mean? I'm happily doing something, right? Is willingness a must be true? Now, it does look, essentially, when you translate this, it says Faxam doesn't want to negotiate. How many of you on your Saturday morning or a Saturday evening want to attend a CR session on assumption? How many of you would attend it if the GMAT were not a requirement? No one would go attend it. I wouldn't be conducting this session if it wasn't a means for me to help our students, right? I don't like doing this on my Friday evening or on my Saturday evening. So willingness doesn't mean inability. Let me just be very, very clear. Okay. Now it's a strengthener for my conclusion. That's something which is there. If you say Faxam's unwilling to negotiate, I believe it increases my belief in the conclusion that the strike is inevitable, but it's not a must be true. All right. Because why? Because we do things despite our willingness. So it's not an assumption. Now, does it strengthen an assumption? Probably not. Probably let's kind of keep on that strengthener for the assumption. I'm going to keep it, but definitely not an assumption. Okay. Decline in profit margins. What does that do? Okay, not an assumption. Why the losses were? That's something that again we can't really say. Okay, what it says is the losses were due to a decline in profit or operational losses. In other words, it's not a one-time expense. It's something that's a consistent expense. Okay. Choice F. Okay, I'm not going to go towards E. I think not very many people. So Maxim doesn't have sufficient cash flow reserves to support. That's something we came up with. It's a pre-thinking. It doesn't have the money to support. That's essential. That must be true for the strike to be inevitable. So essentially, what it's saying is, if even if Faxam wanted to support the demands, it couldn't do that. Why? Because it doesn't have the money. Even if it were willing, it cannot do that. Okay. Now that we know that this is my assumption, what would strengthen this assumption? This is the choice that would strengthen this assumption here. Okay. I'm going to share your responses to the polls here. The first one had about 38% of you got the first one correct. And let's look at the second one. 15% of you got the second one correct. How many of you got both A and B correct? How many of you got both A and B correct? Sorry, I cleared those answers. Okay, good. Perfect. I'm happy to see that. What is the answer of B? Majority of losses are due to a significant decline in profit margins. 6 of you got that right. Perfect. That is good. It seems that everyone who got the first one correct everyone got the second one correct also got the first one correct. Please explain B. Absolutely. Let me explain that. If your assumption is that Faxam does not have sufficient cash flow or cash reserves, the question is what will strengthen this assumption? Not my conclusion. I want to strengthen this assumption. Okay. And for that, what would strengthen this assumption is why the losses were happening. The majority of losses were due to a decline in profit margins. If operational losses were causing the decline in were causing the the losses, if operational reasons were causing the losses, then it makes sense to believe that does not have the cash or cash flows. It strengthens that assumption. So why E is incorrect for the second question, not D. Okay. The 12 laid off employees were not laid off for any performance based reasons. How does that strengthen this assumption that Faxam does not have uh, sufficient cash flow? Can you see any reason why this would strengthen that Faxam does not have sufficient cash flow? The reason why employees were laid off? Why won't we be strengthening the conclusion? Because that's what the question is saying. Let's go back to the question statement here. I'm sorry, I have to go back. The question statement says, sorry. Identify an assumption required by the journalist's argument and a fact that, if true, would most strongly support the required assumption. Okay, would strengthen the assumption, not strengthen the conclusion, strengthen the assumption. Okay. Why is C not the answer for 1? Can anyone tell me what was my reason for rejecting choice C? No, why? Why is it out of scope? Just don't give it a term. Yes, intent and action are very, very different. Willingness. To get a 90th percentile on GMAT CR, should you be willing to study CR or should you be diligent while studying CR? To get 90th percentile on CR, should you be willing to study CR or should you be diligent? Diligent, right? You may not want to study CR, but if you're one of those people who really says, if I choose to do something, I'm going to do it regardless of what my what essentially my heart tells me, because I've taken that as a goal, then you're going to get to that 90th percentile. Yes, even if you're not willing but must do, yes. There are so many things that we do without being willing, right? Many of us do a phenomenal job of that. Most of the time when we have to learn new things, we're not willing. But then if we know the importance of it, we do a really good job. There's another such word which the GMAT uses frequently in difficult questions, both on CR and RC, but in incorrect answer choices. What's another very similar word to willing? Prefer. Yes, thank you. Desire, prefer. XYZ prefers to do it at this time. And a lot of people think that's a must be true. No, preference is not a must be true. If you only have a 9 a.m. time slot to take the GMAT, you will still take it even if you prefer to take it in the evening. Okay? Understand the meaning of these words and what do they represent. And because these are things that are tested again and again in the context of logic. All right. Are we having fun? Are we learning things? So we're going to do one more question, but for those of you who are asking me about, whether e-GMAT has a course in DI, let me actually share the DI course. And then we're going to do one more question here. So for those of you who just have access to the free trial, this is go to the waffle, go into data insights, and you can see a GINTA course here, and it's extremely comprehensive. Each of these has video lessons in there. Each of these has tracking built into it, so you not only get essentially just a completion, you also track your time, we actually track your score. It's going to be very, very similar to what you see with the CR course here. Let's go here, where you get how well you've done this, and how much time you've taken. We track everything in strength and weaken the same way. We also do that in data insights. So let's go into data insights. So we saw GINTA. Two-part analysis similarly has a foundation of it. What does it test? What are the core question stems? Then we go with TPA verbal, which you have CR types, conditions type TPA, and visualization techniques. Just in these, you have about 25 CR arguments here. We have quant type TPA, and then we have TPA quant advanced, where we talk about relationships and visualization here, and very, very similar stuff in multi-source reasoning, uh, where we talk about CR type MSR, we talk about case study type MSR, we assess that proficiency, and then we make sure that you navigate through conditional data sets. So essentially, this course over here has about 40 MSR passages. Just to really put this in context, your OG has about 14 MSR passages, if memory serves me right. Okay, so super comprehensive, and this is just the learning part of the course, not essentially the scholarly part of the course. Okay, now I want you to. We're going to solve one more question before the end of this webinar. This is the question over here. Shelby will refuse. I'm going to give you the poll over here. Let's take about 2.5 minutes to answer this question. I'm going to mute myself. Actually, why don't 20 of you say select not answered? That way, when you choose an answer choice other than not answered, I'll know that you guys have solved the question. About 3 of you have chosen not answered. Let's get to 20 people choosing not answered. 5, 10, 11, 12, 19, 20. Okay, I'm going to remove broadcast results. Good luck, guys. All right, let's get those answers in. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. Broadcast the results. About half the class chose choice D. Choice E is very popular. Choice C is really popular. Only a few people chose choice A. All right, let's look at this. So how is this question? We put in poll over here. How did you feel while answering this question? Easy, confident, moderate, confusing. Seen a similar one before. Okay, I don't believe you would have seen a similar one because this is a fairly unique question, but confused between C and E. Okay, confused between D and E, but chose D. All right. So again, this is a beautiful question, and the reason why we have this question is because it kind of reinforces that point of visualization. So let's kind of see what's happening here. So here in this question, um, and let me bring in my poll once again. Sorry about moving that away. So last year, we actually didn't do any recycling. So all the garbage that we collected, we actually sent that for incineration or for burning. So let's assume that one trash can is the equivalent to one truck. How many trucks did we send for incineration last year? How many trucks did we send for incineration last year? About 10, not 100, 10. Okay. Now this year, we're going to recycle some and we're going to send half as many trucks as we sent last year. Now here's something that I want you to tell me, and I'm going to put in a poll question here. So tell me, how many trucks will we send for incineration if we collect 100 times or 10 times as much refuse as last year, or as we collected last year? If we collect 10 times as much refuse, how many trucks will we send for incineration? Let me just put in the poll question. Here it is. How many trucks will we send for incineration if we collect 10 times as much refuse this year as we did last year? Is it going to be 5, 10, 25, 50, 100? How many trucks do you believe we will send for incineration? 10 times as much refuse as we did last year. Read the argument, then tell me the answer. 23 responses. 24. Come on. Can we get to 40 responses here? You guys have read this argument. 25. How many trucks will we send for incineration if we collect 10 times as much refuse as we did last year? Remember, last year we sent 10 trucks for incineration. How many trucks will we send for incineration this year? Okay. 32, 33. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. And I can see a lot of people changing their answers. So let me broadcast results. 38% of you said 13, 30 or 38% of you said 50. Another 18% say 100. 41% say 5. And 1% says 10. The correct answer is 5. Okay. And the key to the answer is this statement here. Let me just put in. This year, study services will separate for recycling enough refuse to reduce the number of truckloads to half of last year's number. What they're really saying is, regardless of the amount of garbage we collect, we're only going to send half as many trucks as we sent last year for incineration. So if we sent 10 trucks last year, this year we're going to send just 5. Can you see this? Can you see the translation of this statement into this answer over here? Okay. So the total amount of refuse collected this year doesn't matter. Why? Because we're only going to send half as many trucks as we did last year. Now, can you see the value of understanding this while evaluating the entire argument? Can you see the value of reading the entire argument and seeing the value of going slow? Now let's move forward here. So this is our argument structure. Okay. This is what we're trying to establish. We want to reduce the total amount of residual ash to half of what it was last year. And to do that, we're going to send only half as many truckloads. Now, the question is, which of the following is required for the collection program to achieve its aim? Okay. So again, my conclusion is the ash generated this year will be half of what it was last year. Now, what is the basis of conclusion? So what's my falsification question? In what condition, in what scenario will the ash generated be greater than 50%? Given that I'm only going to send half as many trucks for incineration. So if I receive half as many trucks for incineration, in what scenario can I get more ash? In what scenario can we generate ash greater than 50%? What's the only scenario? If there's on average more ash per truckload, right? If you pack those trucks so closely that we generate significantly more ash. Okay. What does it mean is that ash per truckload, so that's the only scenario in which my conclusion breaks down, which means my assumption is that ash per truckload is going to be identical to or lower than what it was last year. Is that clear? Is that clear? Can you really see, if you focus on spending more time on the argument, you can and doing pre-thinking, you can actually get to the answer with a lot more confidence. Okay. Now let's look at the answer choices here. Choice A says, and let me show you your poll results. Here is how you get responded, but half the class got to the correct answer. I want to make sure that you got to the correct answer for the right reasons. Choice C was also very popular. Choice E was popular, as was choice A. Let's hide this. Choice A says, this year, no materials that the city services could separate for recycling will be incinerated. Essentially, what's recycled is not burned. That must be true? Absolutely. But does it provide new information? Absolutely not. Why? Because you can infer this from the argument itself. Choice B, no one chose choice B. So this is wrong because there's no new information here. Again, remember, an assumption satisfies two conditions. It must be true. It also provides new information. This does satisfy the MBT condition, doesn't satisfy the new information. Okay. Choice B talks about the cost of disposing. That's irrelevant here. Choice C talks about the proportion of recyclable materials. Okay. Now, do we care about the proportion of recyclable materials in the total refuse? Absolutely not. Why? Because we're only going to get half as many truckloads. People who chose choice C, can you see why this is wrong? Lots of you chose choice C. Can you see why this is wrong? Okay. Choice D is the correct answer. It talks about average ash generated per truckload. And yeah, you look at the negation of this and you'd see the conclusion breaks down. Let's look at choice E. Choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. Does it matter whether it's greater than or less than what it was last year? No. Why? Because we're only going to get half as many truckloads. You can also see the negation test applied to this, and it has no impact on the conclusion. Why? Because we are only going to get half as many truckloads. Okay. People who chose choice E, can you see why choice E is wrong? Okay. I would like to see a few more yeses here. All right. So, what are your key takeaways? How do you think you can get to that 90th percentile? Pre-thinking, okay. What else? What else? How are you going to change your behavior going forward? What's the first thing that you're going to take away? What's the second thing they're going to take away? And then what's the third thing? Visualization. First thing. Second thing is building that logical structure. And then it comes, then pre-thinking comes. Okay. Really important. EG matters. Do you have a better idea on how to approach pre-thinking now? Okay. Really important. Focus on building those core skills. The timing will automatically fall in place. Okay. Now, what should you do next? Well, it's not. I'm not going to take the credit till I help you get to that 90th percentile. So let's make sure we get there. Then I'll say all thanks to your diligence that you improved that score. Okay, but I want to make sure that you stay on that path. So we have two groups here: those of you who are not paid students and those of you who are paid students. So let's kind of make sure what each one of you should do. If you're not a paid student, the next thing you've got to do over here is focus on seeing pre-thinking in action through C2 over here. This is your free trial. This is where you are. This is free trial over here. Okay, so you should look at pre-thinking in action, C2 and C3, and then C4 assumption application. Really make sure that you do that over here, and then you also have a few questions in the scholarinium part of the free trial where you can take a few custom quizzes. In this case here by clicking on create custom quizzes, and again make sure you understand what all of these mean in this case. Let's go back to our free trial. And if you want to understand the GI course, you have the DI course, you have some GI, you have MSR over here, and then other aspects of quant. So all of this is a part of the free trial. It's about 4% of all the course that we offer. If you are a paid student and if you're someone who's starting with CR right now, what's really important is you understand where you learn visualization, and that's where the inference module is really critical, where you focus on understanding how do words only and all impact the visualization. What's the visualization for some, most, and the, and this is where you go from simple statements to complex statements, and these are complex files in terms of the examples here, the exercises here will actually make you think. And some of you may think, hey, inference, I'm going to get one, at the most two questions. Why do we need to really go through so much learning here? Because a lot of the foundation that you build over here helps you visualize the conclusion, helps you build that logical structure. It helps you visualize answer choices. Those of you who are talking about how to identify which statement is the conclusion, that's where premise and conclusion help you here. And you can see that we spend about 2 hours on premise and conclusion. Then you go into the assumption piece where for every argument type, we teach you how to go about coming up with pre-thinking. And this is where you visualize all sorts of arguments. Again, make sure you build that visualization ability, where you're comparing two entities, where you have segments, where you have both entities and segments and quant-based arguments. Then you go through the application and practice quizzes. So just in this assumption module, you have 10 learning activities. You have close to 45 to 50 arguments here. We do the same thing and evaluate. You can see there's one concept file. Why? Because once you go through this, you already know all the argument types. You already know all the visualization. So we just teach you the evaluate concept. And then you have 3 application files, 3 practice quizzes. Again, another 25 odd arguments here just for evaluate. Very, very similar, actually a greater number for strengthen, and the same for weaken as well. So after this, a lot of it is application of those specific concepts. So in strengthen, we talk about pre-thinking in the context of strengthen, and then applying that pre-thinking in the concept of weaken, then boldface. And this is a really, really important piece where boldface passages are usually more complex. They have more claims in them with multiple intermediate conclusions and one main conclusion. We go through that, and then you have logically complete and fill in the blanks, and then you go through cementing. Really, really critical that you go through that cementing process overall. Okay. So hopefully you understand the role played by each of the files in this. Okay, so make sure you go through this overall. But again, the key thing that's there is this is not rocket science. You can use this to not only build your skills, but to also make sure you improve your hit rate, you to hit that 90th percentile. As you build your core skills, as you get better at pre-thinking, the timing will improve automatically. That 90th percentile will happen automatically. Focus on learning. Okay. All right. Any questions that you have? Questions and or feedback on the webinar? Let me actually share the session presentation with you, because with that I've come to the end of this webinar. Be happy to take on any question in the Q&A pod. Okay. RBS, if I have only 2 weeks before the attempt, which are the most important CR files on e-GMAT? It depends on what your data says. Let me just be very clear. At e-GMAT, we're all about personalizing your learning. So if you have taken cementing quizzes in Scholarium, we'll have enough data to really tell you what's your weakness, and then accordingly we can recommend. But without that, I don't want to say this file is more important than this file. And for the very simple reason, I mean, our decision tree is going to go this way. If you have medium accuracy, and if your hard accuracy, let's say the threshold is 55%, and if you're at 45%, then I'm going to look at specific metrics within calling him to really say which aspect of hard questions is troubling you. Is it in bold fills? Is it in strengthen? Is it in weaken? Because the medium one tells me you already have enough ability to build that logical structure, and accordingly I'm going to recommend certain files on the platform. So your question is which files are valuable for me, and the answer to that is it depends on where you need help. So your stats will tell us, write to us. We have a support team that will look at that data for you, but only after you've done cementing. Okay. How does a cementing question differ from other questions? At a question level, it's not, but cementing quizzes. So every question when we that we create is given the same care. It's evaluated in the same way. The solutions are just as in depth. What cementing quizzes do is they have a good mix of, they have the right mix according to us of argument based questions where you have to look outside the argument, where you have to evaluate the structure of the argument, or where you have to draw inferences from the argument. And that's where we trust the results of cementing quizzes as much more representative of your performance on the test. Now, if on the other hand, let's say you do 100 questions in Scholarium and you have 50 medium, 50 hard, and your stats are really phenomenal in Scholarium, that's just as good. At the same time, we can come to the same kind of confidence with way fewer questions and cementing quizzes, because we know that the distribution is right. We know that there is no bias in the distribution. So at a question level, really, there's no difference. At an aggregate level, cementing helps us compare your performance against the performance of other fellow test takers, which is where we can have that confidence to really say that, hey, if you have 3 cementing quizzes, and you cross that threshold of 70%, you're ready for hard. If you cross that threshold of 55%, you're at a 70th percentile ability. Why? Because we've seen 10,000 plus test takers that cross that and accordingly get a high score on the real GMAT, and then that gives us that confidence to really say that we are 95% confidence you're going to get higher than this. Okay. Usman says, I cannot seem to decide whether to take the regular or the focus edition. How do I decide? Very simple. I mean, I've written in this article, is the GMAT focus edition hard? That actually tells you at a very high level for what kind of people. The focus edition's harder compared to the current edition, or vice versa. But at a high level, what I recommend that you do is, solve about 20, 25 questions, or 20 questions in verbal, including SC, so that you have an idea of the format of the questions, about 10 to 20 questions on quant, and then about 12 to 14 questions on IR. Then take a current edition and a focus edition mark, and your starting abilities is a significant difference, then you would know. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to really say, if you like SC, then take the current edition. If you like SC and if you are close enough to your target score that you can take the GMAT current edition within 40 days, then you take the current edition. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend taking the current edition. I'd recommend taking the focus edition, because you won't be able to take the current edition after 31st of January. Okay. If you've been preparing using the current edition, then if you are an e-GMATer, and if SC is your strong point, then write to us, and we can evaluate your stats. If you're not an e-GMATer, but if you have your ability scores, uh, and if SC is a strong point, then take the current edition as well. So within verbal, what's your strong point? That's something that you have to really look at. How to handle when I don't understand the passage and its actual meaning? Two things over there. When you're solving the question, go slow. And again, here again, you're in two phases over here. If you're in the learning phase, you can go as slow as possible, break down, stop and visualize every 5 to 7 words, and you'll understand that. If you're doing this on a test where you can't go significantly slower because it's going to impact other question, your performance and other questions, then randomly mark this, but tell yourself this is an opportunity to learn. This is where your biggest learning in as part of that quiz is going to come from. Why? Because this question exposed something that you were unaware of. So congratulate yourself that you've discovered that question. Post that, go to that question, spend 20 minutes on it, understand each and every aspect of it, make sure you're 100% certain as to why the correct answer is correct, why you made a mistake, why you made a mistake, and there'll be multiple places where you misread this question. Understand each of those places, and that would make you a much better test taker post this. Okay, so yeah, don't be shy of such questions, because they do teach you something. If you're new to the GMAT, how do you start preparing for it? Same way. Practice a few questions, take a mock test, build a study plan. Okay, check out the free trial. So hopefully that helps you evaluate what we have. How comprehensive is our focus edition course? I think it's the most comprehensive in the industry. I've compared our course to the courses offered by the only other two companies that offer a GFE course now. That's Target Test Prep and Magoosh, and this is at least twice as comprehensive as the course offered by Target Test Prep. We have video solutions, we have mocks, and at least 5 times as comprehensive as that offered by Magoosh. Okay. And Ashwin, I see your question. Write to me. I want to explain to you what percentiles versus ability levels mean. And when I do that, it will make sense to you. Okay, so just write to me and I'm going to record a video for you with regards to your study plan. Okay. All right, guys, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Once again, if you're not connected to me on LinkedIn, please connect with me on LinkedIn and or on Reddit. If you have doubts, I can address them on any platform. You can write to me at gmail.com. Thank you and have a wonderful day. How many hard questions can you expect in the entire exam? It depends on how you're doing. But if, let's say, you want to get to the peak, then on the verbal side, out of the 23 questions on the focus edition, you're going to probably get 17 hard. Okay. Hopefully that helps. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.